Hello and welcome to another episode of the Meet the Translator podcast. In today's episode, I'm joined by 3 university lecturers who focus on various aspects of translation in their teachings. And today we're going to be talking about the link between academia and the profession of translation and interpreting. I was initially contacted by a senior publisher at Routledge regarding a new series called Routledge Introductions to Translation and Interpreting. Sergey edits the series, and Callum and Joseph are authors of 2 of the books in the series. Callum wrote Translation Project Management, which came out in December, and Joseph wrote Translation Ethics, which is now also available. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, thank you all for joining me on my podcast today. It's really, really lovely to have you all here. Shall we start with some little introductions? Could you each tell me a bit about who you are, what it is you do, your sort of experience of the translation and interpreting industry, and your sort of field of interest within? I know that's a lot of questions, but basically a little introduction. Should we start with Sergey?
Well, my name is Sergey Tyulenev. Now I work as a professor of translation studies at Durham University in the MA in translation studies there. In terms of my professional experience, I used to work for a couple of decades while still back in Russia in various sectors. So I started working in the 90s. There were some groups of missionaries, Christian missionaries coming. So that was my first exposure to interpreting mostly. Then a bit of translation. Then I worked in an organization called Pricewaterhouse. So I worked in oil and gas department there. So that was a completely different experience. But all of that contributed to my getting acquainted with the industry on the ground, so to speak. Then I immigrated to Canada, and then I worked a little bit in medical interpreting. So again, a completely different area of experience. And then I started doing more research and teaching. So now I do occasionally some translation work, but less than before.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, Joseph, do you want to go next?
Yeah, tough act to follow. It's nowhere near as exciting as Sergey's background. But for me, I'm now a lecturer in translation studies at Cardiff University and used to work with Sergey and Callum at Durham briefly. And my industry background is I used to work as a freelance translator, mostly in the field of sports translation. And this was for a few years after doing an MA in translation studies, and I always wanted to be a translator. I really enjoyed the work from studying languages at school, and saw myself working there. But I really I'd enjoyed the academic side during my MA as well, and decided that when the opportunity was there, I'd do a PhD, and this has led me down this academic path. So academically, I'm interested in sort of all things ethics in translation, as I'm sure we'll get into shortly, but also the link between academia and the translation industry, which I know is sort of the topic today as well. So actually thinking about research that is relevant to the professions.
Interesting that you were also a freelance translator.
It was something that I always really, really enjoyed, and unfortunately now I have very little time for actual translating, which is a real shame. And I think Callum's nodding already, like it's a similar thing for him. It was something I loved doing, and I saw myself carrying on doing, but then just got sucked into the academic side, which I do love as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it'll be interesting for a lot of listeners, because I think most of my listeners are freelance translators, so maybe they'll want to become professors at some point. I don't know. So Callum, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm a lecturer in translation technology at the University of Leeds. So kind of like Joseph, really, I sort of started out in the freelance sector. So I think I started as a freelancer back in 2009. French and Russian into English in my language pairs, and I worked with legal documents predominantly, or business finance sort of stuff. I sort of branched into a little bit of outsourcing, which I still run on a very small scale to this day, which kind of feeds into my interest in project management as well. And then, kind of like Joseph, really, I started taking an interest in sort of academic side of things, started working towards my PhD, which was on a bit more of a sort of blue skies project, admittedly. But since then, my interest has sort of returned back to my my roots in professional translation. So I suppose in very broad terms, my research interests are kind of translation industry studies, so particularly project management. I'm very interested in sort of the economics of translation, in all the dimensions of economics. But yeah, in exactly the same way that Joseph was just saying, that sort of interaction and relevance of academic research to real world practice is what I find really interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be an interesting topic as well, because a lot of translators do study translation. I know there's like various ways to get into it, but a lot of translators do study translation and then go on to be translators. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how it actually can benefit them as translators, or like what, I don't know. Yeah, we'll get into it in a minute anyway. So I sort of kind of got to, well, I'm getting to know you, but like I know you because of this new Routledge Introductions to Translation and Interpreting series. So obviously there are, as far as I can see, there's 3 books in the series, right? So there's Translation Project Management, Translation Ethics, and Translation Tools and Technologies, one of which just came out today, right? Yeah. And I think the last one is it coming out next? Is this?
I think it's coming on the 18th or something, April, so the second half of April.
Okay, so that'll be coming out soon as well. Sergey, maybe you can talk a bit about this first. Why were these topics chosen for the series? Is there going to be more books coming in the future, or like, can you sort of tell us a little bit about the whole thing?
Yeah, well, I'll start probably briefly with the rationale behind this series, because, I've taught translation actually in several countries and continents even. I started in Russia, then I taught translation in Canada, then I came to the UK, and then I went to South Africa, and then back to the UK. So I've seen how translation is taught, and obviously I've been teaching it for almost 3 decades now. And I was really, well, I think it's our all shared impression that we lack teaching materials, especially at the beginner's level. So the programs, translation and interpreting teaching programs, are very popular, and they're becoming more and more popular and widespread. But usually students are given just handouts, or maybe they're sent to a chapter in one publication, a chapter in another publication. So at the end, as a result, the student ends up with a disordered heap of materials, and it's very difficult for them to imagine the subject area as a coherent whole. That's why I came to Routledge and suggested this series where we would publish textbooks. When a student starts studying maths, for example, or biology, they're given a textbook which helps them to be introduced into that subject area. The same, I think, should be done with translation and interpreting. So there should be a textbook which introduces them into a particular aspect of this profession. And that's why we started this series. So far, it's a relatively new series. We've just, as has been mentioned, we've just published 2 books by Callum and by Joseph, and we're expecting the 3rd one later in April. But actually, we are planning to have many more, which some will reflect what is already staple courses in the programs, and some will be opening new vistas, so to speak. or new courses that might be taught. So we are planning to have, besides the three ones, we are planning to have localization, translation, a commentary one that will help students to understand one of the assignments that is present in all the translator and interpreter training programs, how to write a translation commentary. Then terminology management for translators, translation and community, audiovisual translation, subtitling, etc. So yeah, we will try to cover all the, if not all, then the majority of the most important aspects of what translators and interpreters have to know, what they do, what they need to know for their training, etc.
Sounds like it can be really, really useful, actually.
I hope so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to hear the other books that you've got coming up as well. I think it'll be, good for students.
It will be, actually, we are planning that it will be useful for both students and teachers. So, yeah, there is a double target audience, so to speak. So it's the textbooks could be used, and actually even professionals, if they would like to refresh or just to introduce themselves to a new area of expertise, then they can just grab that particular textbook and read it on their own.
Yeah, that was something I was going to ask you about later, actually, because obviously as I think especially as freelance translators or interpreters, we're constantly having to do CPD and make sure that we are keeping up to date with all the developments in the industry and everything. So it can be useful. It could be useful so for us to have these sort of resources. And also a lot of us do such different things within even though we've got a similar job title or whatever, we do such different things that we might want to branch into something else, or suddenly we have some ethical issue that we've never had before. We're like, oh no, what do we do? So yeah, it sounds like it could be useful for a lot of people. Also, I'll just quickly ask, in case anyone who's listening does want to buy the books, where are they actually available for purchase?
So they can purchase directly from the Routledge website, so routledge.com. They are also available via rout.com, rout.com, and often at a discount, so that may come handy. They can also be bought or ordered via the majority of major bookshops which sell academic publications, and they're available in three basic formats: paperback, hardback, and e-publications. So it's very easy to buy them or order them again.
Okay, that's good. I'll make sure to put some of those links in the show notes so it's easy to find. Let's talk a little bit about some of the books that there are now. Callum, do you want to say a bit about the translation project management book that you've written and sort of why it's an important resource and how it can benefit students and translators and teachers?
Yeah, certainly. So I've taught translation project management in various forms in quite a few different ways. In fact, it actually started for me back at Durham when I was working with Sergey. And one of the things that I realized at that time is that the number of publications that are actually available to students and to teachers on project management is very limited. So there are sporadic articles which touch upon very, very specific aspects of it. There's an edited volume that brings together snapshots of different aspects of it. But with only one exception I'm aware of, which is written by Hannah Risku in German. To my knowledge, it's not been translated into English either. There's no coherent sort of book length work. And moreover, her book is actually very research based. It's less inclined towards the teaching side of things. So this was the main rationale for this, really, in that project management is so very central to what we do as translators. Even if you're a freelancer, the chances are that you interact with project managers every single day, and they're the ones that act as the go-betweens between the end clients and the vendors that actually do the work. So it's been very neglected. So actually teaching it is quite difficult in some ways, because it's very difficult to point students towards accessible resources that actually provide a coherent picture of what goes on in project management without just showing them tiny snapshots of little aspects within it. So the book itself focuses, so the first few chapters are focused on workflow, and this follows an ISO standard that's to do with translation service provision. So the first, chapters 2 to 4 are centered around pre-production, so the inquiry, setting up projects and sort of sending out to vendors. Production, which is fairly self-explanatory and includes translation and all the other types of services that go with it. And then post-production, so what happens after the kind of main production act is complete. The rest of the book then moves on to what are called project management constraints. So these are time, cost, quality, scope, benefits, and risk. And these are all aspects that interact in different ways with the way in which we manage projects, and in turn how we can manage those constraints to better perform a project in different ways. So these are things that, again, they've been touched upon in lots of different places, but to bring them all together was the main objective here, and to paint that overall picture of what goes on in the PM context. So you asked as well about the benefit for professionals and for service providers. So I suppose the obvious readership, if you like, or the target reader is PMs or those looking to be PMs within language service providers. But one thing that I do regularly tell my students is that these sorts of skills are useful for everyone. So even as a freelancer, you are project managing all the time. Just because you do it in a different configuration, it doesn't mean that awareness of, say, the interaction between time, cost and quality isn't relevant to you in some way. So really that was the aim for it. And I think just having that bigger picture for freelancers as well, beyond the boundaries within which you normally work, I would like to think is quite enlightening. That was certainly my intention, at least.
Yeah, I think it definitely, because as you said, like, we are sort of managing our own projects as well in a sense, and like especially when working with direct clients rather than agencies or LSPs, we are also kind of doing that. And then some translators do also outsource work to other translators, so it's kind of like and there are obviously translators who are translators and project managers as well. Like, I've got a few friends who are freelance project managers as well as translators, and they do both. But also I think, like, as translators, it's also just good to have an awareness of what, because we're constantly in contact with project managers from like other, you know, companies or LSPs or whatever. It's good for us to have an awareness of what they're having to deal with and like their sort of process for things, so that we can like provide a better service to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like it could be really, really useful. And then we've got Joseph, who wrote the book, the Translation Ethics book. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, why is that an important resource, and who does it benefit other than like the students?
Yeah, of course. And my book is officially out today as well, by those we're recording this, which is really exciting. So I was saying to Sergey before, it's a nice excuse to pop up some champagne after the recording's done today. We can edit that out in case my bosses are listening. But yeah, so there's a parallel between what Callum was saying, really, because ethics is something that we've spoken about in translation studies for decades now in various forms, and it's something that obviously has been important in the translation industry for a long time. Professionals have been talking about ethics for decades, if not much longer. But really, the coverage that's out there is a bit fragmented. So there's bits and pieces here about, you know, philosophical ethics. There's bits and pieces here about codes of ethics, for instance. And so this textbook was intended to kind of bring together various discussions in a very sort of accessible, user-friendly, reader-friendly form. And I start off with some very light touch coverage of sort of philosophical foundations of ethics, then look at more of the academic side in translation ethics, and looking at interpreting as well a little bit. So thinking from sort of how we engage with the words on the page all the way to more active, maybe even sort of activist roles as translators and interpreters as well. And then I move on to the translations profession specifically as well. As I said, this is something that I think is really important, and it's something that is changing. It's very dynamic at the moment. So I talk about codes of ethics, critique them, and talk about a whole host of sort of pressing current concerns as well. Because what we've seen in the last couple of years is that there's a bit of a resurgence of interest in ethics and questions of sustainability as well. So with global economic, financial, environmental crises going on, we need to talk about ethics, and in the translation profession as well, with new roles, the constant development of technology, more attention being paid to mental health concerns, which I know is something you've spoken about on your podcast before, Dot, as well. Mm-hmm. This is, it's arguably more important than ever. So I'm trying to capture sort of this current situation, anticipate some future concerns, and this is quite tricky. It's shifting. It's really exciting to be doing this, but it's a difficult thing to do as well. But in terms of the importance of all that, I guess the upshot is that hopefully this is going to be a useful entry point for a lot of people. So for students, for teachers, obviously, ethics is something that we're teaching a lot in university courses. The textbook is based on classes I've taught at several UK universities, and it's full of case studies as well to try and contextualise these ideas, which can sometimes be a bit abstract. But I hope that people in the industry are going to find it useful as well, because it's, sometimes translation professionals just have codes of ethics to look at, and they're a bit abstract, a bit detached. There's some sort of things that aren't covered there. So hopefully they'll be able to read this and think, oh, actually, this is something that I want to look at in more detail, or that's something I hadn't considered before as well. So there's a very deliberate industry-based focus, similar to what Callum was saying about his textbook as well.
I can imagine that's quite like a challenging book to write, because also I don't know, but I feel like ethics are also something that can be personal to an individual. Like, for example, personally, I wouldn't ever translate anything about meat production or whatever, because I don't think it's ethical for people to eat meat and for animals to be found in that way. So personally, I would not take those kind of projects, but then for other people, they wouldn't see that as unethical. So sure,
no, precisely. I mean, it's sort of getting into this subjective nature of ethics is a big part of the textbook, and a lot of it, because I can't just say that there's a right or a wrong answer. It's just about inviting reflection, sort of pointing out, oh, maybe this is something you want to consider, but you've got to make your own mind up on it. So it's challenging in that respect, but I like that. There's no black or white when it comes to ethics, which is nice.
And I think it's something as well that it's good to think about and reflect on, and it's also something that can be constantly changing for each of us as well as we learn new things, or I don't know. I mean, it's normal to change your views on things, isn't it? Anyway, so. Yeah, that sounds like it could be useful for a lot of people as well. Some really interesting topics here. So, shall we talk a bit more generally about the link between academia and the profession of translation and interpreting? So obviously, Sergey, you've said the books that are going to be coming up in the series as well. So I guess those topics are sort of what you would see, I assume, as the most important areas of study for translation interpreting students. What do you think are the key things that a translation interpreting student needs to learn to then be able to go on and have a profession as a translator or interpreter?
Yeah, obviously the question of translator interpreter competencies is now a very hot topic in translation and interpreting studies as a discipline, but also in the industry. I remember when we were part of Europe still, I went to the EMT, it's European Master in Translation network. We had this discussion with representatives of the industry discussing what translators and interpreters should be taught today in these programs. So it is really important, and it's very pertinent to what we're discussing today about the links between academia and the professional world. And by the way, we are one of the next publications will be exactly on this. The working title of the book is Working as a Professional Translator Interpreter. It's written by our colleague from Newcastle University, Jean-Christophe Penny. So there have been several models suggested of competencies, looking at what translators should be taught, what translators should be able to do. And usually when we ask people who is a translator, they usually reduce it to the ability of, to the knowledge of foreign languages and to the ability to mediate between them. But actually all these models show that it's much more. In today's world, translators need to obviously know the languages. Obviously, they need cultural expertise. Obviously, they need to know how to mediate between these different languages and cultures, or across different languages and cultures. But also, they need to be technologically literate, right? They need to know translators. They can afford to work without recourse to CAD tools, or if they work with, say, machine translation, they need to know what pre or post editing is and how to do that. Then, obviously, there are certain skills which we call soft skills, which are the ability to communicate with different people. So with different colleagues, talking about translation project management. Obviously, translators, freelance or in-house translators, they need to talk with a lot of people, clients, commissioners, authors of the documents that they're translating. So these are also very important skills. And these are the skills that we hope reflect and cover, hopefully exhaustively, in our series. That's what we are doing within this series. It's one of the objectives. But maybe Joseph and Callum could add something.
Just on the back of that, something that was occurring to me as you were talking was within the context of that EMT framework, the competence framework. Sorry, some stages of it are very well documented in translation studies. So one of those competences is just translation competence, which there is abundant literature, the books, articles, everything on how to translate, if you can actually document such a thing quite so well. What I think is really good about this series is that in particular, two of the other competences that are among that framework are service provision and interpersonal skills, or I think it's something, is it interpersonal? It's something like that, isn't it? So books like the one that Sergey just mentioned that's being written by J.C. Brunet, things about ethics, project management, they cover those aspects of training that at the moment don't have a lot written about them, because there are quite a lot of books, for example, on how to become a translator. And when you read some of them, they offer some very interesting insights, but often a lot of it's quite based on personal experience or anecdote. And with this particular book that Sergey was talking about, for example, it will draw on those personal experiences, but it will also bring in a lot of the research side of things as well. So I think this is what, to me, I find quite exciting about this series, is that it starts to address some aspects of that competence framework that up to now have, I wouldn't say been completely neglected, but there's certainly a lot less on those sort of softer elements of what we do as translators. But Joseph, is there anything you wanted to add? Because I think I jumped in there.
Well, I think you've both covered it really nicely. And I can just echo. I've read some of JC's book so far, and it's fantastic. And I think your listeners will definitely want to keep an eye out for this one, the one on sort of professional translation. Reading it, I was thinking, as a student, this is exactly what I wish I had when I was doing an MA. This book is it's just so rich and detailed in terms of actually how to get started in a career. So that's another one that's well worth looking for. In terms of the question, Sergey's covered most things in terms of the key areas for study. But one thing I'd add in terms of technology, particularly because I think this is a really, really key area right now. It's something that's developing so quickly. It's something that's not going away anytime soon. But one thing I'd add is kind of rather than the skills itself, the field of just learning how to use a tool perfectly, I think it's more about the mindset that we're teaching, this kind of curiosity, this willingness to experiment, this willingness to get things wrong that's really, really important. And talking to LSP owners recently, that's kind of come through from them. They want graduates who come to them not just knowing one specific tool, because they'll have to use different tools, but wanting them to not say, oh, I'm afraid of technology, but rather, yep, they'll just dive in and they're willing to do that. So I think that's something that I'm trying to teach at Cardiff, and I think is really, really important, that mindset, that willingness to engage with new tools, new emerging roles and trends in the industry as well.
I think that's interesting because, I feel like there is constantly new software and new updates to things, and it can be hard sometimes to keep on top of it. And then also I find as a subtitler, a lot of my the bigger agency clients will have their own software as well, and then it's you're constantly you have to use their software to be able to work with them. And I know other translation clients will, or companies will have their own CAT tools, or there's the cloud-based ones, or they might so that you don't have to download the files and then resend it to them. It's all online, and you start working with a new client and there's you have to learn a whole new software and how their whole system works. So I think that's definitely an important one. I found during my studies there was a lot of theory, it was very theory heavy, and it kind of left me wondering how useful actually was it to have all of that theory. And I think it's good to have in the back of your mind, and I probably use it more subconsciously than I'm actually aware of. But it also felt maybe that was a bit more useful for people who then wanted to go on to do a PhD rather than people who then wanted to go on to be translators. And I think it was a bit lacking in the business side of things, considering I don't know the exact statistics, but I know that there's a lot of freelancers in the translation industry compared to in-house people, and I felt a lot of us just go into it and we're basically, as a freelancer, you're running your own business without ever really learning how to have a business. So I think things like the soft skills that you mentioned, communication is obviously a part of that, but there's so many other aspects to running a business that it sort of have to learn on the go. Do you think that there could be more business aspects in place of some of the theory, or do you think it's important to have as much? I mean, obviously it might have changed a little bit since I studied, and I know that different universities have different kind of courses. I feel a lot of people I've spoken to said that their courses were very theory heavy. Do you think that's that important?
I'll say might be, because obviously I would call this. I come across, obviously, this question every time I speak to students, to professional practicing translators and interpreters. I would call it thorny, or even quoting further Dostoevsky, cursed question in our industry. It's there. But I personally, I teach translation theory, and I personally believe that probably it's partly the fault of academia that we present it in a probably, if not wrong, then skewed way that impresses our students that it's really not as practical as it should be, or but I do believe that translation theory is important, because we hope to hold translation a profession and not just an occupation, right? And that requires our knowledge of this field, of this of the skills that we are performing, and talking again about translation project management, for example. That's how I present theory to my students. I ask them to imagine themselves as translation project managers when, for example, you might have on your team colleagues who work with language combinations which you don't know. So you need to know, you need to be able to diagnose, as it were, the problems, the aspects that all the translators on your team should handle in a consistent way. So that requires theory. So you need to understand more than goes into your ability just to toggle between these two languages. So it requires much more. It requires understanding. Also talking about these business aspects of translation, obviously, and again, this part of the series publications that would address these different aspects. Practical aspects, but also, see, for example, we're talking in translation studies as a discipline, we're talking about the sociological turn, where we study exactly those aspects of translation that were less interesting to previous theories of translation. So now we're looking at translation as it exists in its natural habitat, so to speak, where translators need to act not only as language service providers, but in many other roles. So yes, my answer, short answer to that question would be that yes, we still need theory if we want to become a profession rather than an occupation. But of course, that theory should be reconsidered, and what should be included into that theory of translation should be given another thought.
I think when you mentioned the question, Dot, it made me think of my colleague. So at the very start of it's not called Translation Theory at Leeds, but what is essentially our translation theory module, my colleague, Professor Jeremy Munday, his first lecture on that is called The Need for Theory. And he goes through exactly these points. To avoid sort of rehashing what Sergey has already said, the one thing that comes to my mind is that I think the nature, or rather the relevance of translation theory is changing. So if you look at the sort of development of the discipline of translation studies, the theory that developed in the early days of the discipline was very linguistically oriented, and it was quite prescriptive in the sense that, this is how you should translate this. If you encounter this, then do this, basically. And what Sergey was talking about with the sociological turn is I think what's now filtering through to the university systems, and rightly so, is the focus on the more descriptive paradigm of what actually takes place in real world settings. And this is where I think publications such as the book on ethics by Joseph and others on the profession and tools, it's making theory take on a different dimension to what it used to do, because it's describing how ethical issues arise in the context of translating linguistic and cultural problems on the page. And when I teach things like this, ethics, for example, I do a lecture on ethics and a seminar on it. I have to say I use Joseph's materials and they're fantastic. My students really like those lessons because actually when you start to talk about theory, in inverted commas, in the context of a real life scenario and look at, say, the ethical dimensions of a particular problem, then it makes it relatable instead of talking about some historic linguistic theory of translation that it only occurs in very, very isolated cases and very artificial examples.
I think you've put it well, and I suppose I could touch upon this idea that it's more suited to PhD study, because here at Cardiff we do have sort of a practical side or industry-driven side to the MA, and still some theory modules which are in some ways geared towards further study. But I think regardless of what you want to get out of the MA, where you want to go, studying theory is and particularly in this current form, this sort of reshaped, reconfigured form of theory that Sergey and Callum have both spoken about, it's going to add strings to your bow. It's going to add something in terms of your understandings of the potential roles that you can play as a translator or interpreter, your position in society, the power that you have or don't have as well. And these are really, really important issues, and it allows you to engage with the industry in a much more effective way, I think. And this is something that we need to do in terms of these questions of sustainability, which I talk about a lot in terms of ethics. We need to be politically minded. We need to be involved as translators, and that's where the theory, I think, can definitely help. But at the same time, I do agree that these kind of dry discussions of archaic linguistic theories potentially aren't the most directly relevant, and I'm always going to say there should be more industry-focused material in there, because that's something that I'm really interested in. I think we can do that with theory. I think we can marry the two together much more effectively, and I think that's happening in a lot of universities as well, which is really good to see. But it's a question that comes up and is tackled directly in pretty much every university I'm familiar with now.
Mm-hmm. I think definitely, I think theory is probably, I would have probably enjoyed it more, or found it easier if it was here's a bit of theory and then here's how it actually relates to what you can do. As you said, marrying the two together, I think is a great idea, and it's good that that's kind of what's being done, because personally, I never really liked reading, and so I hated it when I had to sit there and look through books and read loads and loads of things and not, I don't know, I mean, it's probably why I've kind of gone into subtitling, but I didn't, I think that's I never really enjoyed the theory part because it meant I had to do loads of reading. But I
think this is one of the nice things about the way that theory's developed, though, because in terms of how we implement theoretical teaching now, especially when you start to bring in things like technology, ethics, the real world, the types of examples we use in our lectures and our classes now they're not book based. I use videos off YouTube as case studies. So in one of my lectures a few weeks back, I used a case study it was actually a comedy clip of an interpreter in a school setting he was interpreting for his dad, and it was completely artificial in the sense that it was a comedy sketch, but because it included an interpreter, it was a perfect example to talk about ethical conduct. So all these things about ethics, about technology, about our interaction, communication, the nature of the materials we can now use is even better, again, than looking at stale, here's an example of this particular translation strategy in this very unique context. So I think that's also beneficial to the students as well.
And I think having that critical mindset of saying, actually, the theory doesn't work here is something that we invite a lot more in universities now. I know at Durham, this is something that was an aim, and at Cardiff, it definitely is as well. Students, if they can sit down and reflect on theory and say, actually, in the profession, this doesn't work, or these ideas work better than those. I think that's excellent as well, and that's something that you can take away from these. So it's not just a case of, you've got to use these ideas, but rather, you can actually say where they're going to be useful, how they will apply, and when they won't apply as well. I think that's something that we're trying to foster a lot more. And the shape of assessments has to allow for that. It can't just be a traditional academic essay which forces you to list the strengths of an idea. It's got to allow scope for that reflective, critical reflection.
Mm-hmm. And do you find, as lecturers, are you able to have a decent amount of freedom on what you can teach and all that? Because is there a board or something that says every university that does this course has to include this and this or something? I'm sure I remember one of my lecturers saying, we have to include this much theory because we're told we have to for it to be able to be called this course or something. Is that a thing? And do you get much flexibility?
I think it depends is the key answer, isn't it? It depends where you are. But I mean, in terms of the EMT accreditation that Sergey mentioned before, that if you wanted to be accredited by the European Masters in Translation, you have to teach certain things. Although that's actually the opposite of theory. I don't think theory is really one of the...
Yeah, the EMT was very heavy on, you must do, for example, they insisted on doing more things like post-editing and lots of stuff on tech. And so the EMT actually went the opposite way in saying... It didn't say get rid of theory, of course, but it was saying actually the professional skills side of things is much more important than What your lecturers might have been referring to is the fact that universities often have very convoluted module approvals and program approval systems where if you want to make changes to a taught curriculum, you have to submit module amendments, and then they go through boards, and so to actually change a module takes at least a year usually.
Oh wow.
So you have to work within the confines of what the module description is, and if you want to deviate from that quite significantly, the process to change that can be quite lengthy and lots of paperwork. That could have been what they were referring to, but then again, every university is different as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Another thing I was thinking of is that I know a lot of translators become translators after studying translation, but there's also quite a lot of translators that study something else and then have that as their specialism. Like they might do a medical degree and then become medical translators or interpreters and not actually do the translation studies thing. Like, what are your sort of thoughts on that? Do you think that translators need to have done translation studies as well as something else if they want to because obviously specialising in something like medical or legal, like you kind of need more. I'm not saying you necessarily need a whole degree in that, but like you do need like more of that as well. Like, do they need to do twice as much studies, or like what do you think about that?
Well, I could probably say something based on my own experience. So when I started working as an interpreter / translator, I was still a student of English at Moscow State University. So in a sense, I had had no background before I started working as a translator. But then, of course, I started reading because that's also what I say to my students in my theory classes, is that it's, in a sense, it's silly to try and reinvent the wheel. So people have already done a lot of translating and they've learned certain things about it and how to handle an idiom, how to handle a term, for example, talking about a specific subject area. So you can try and learn by trial and error, or you can just go and read on that particular aspect. And of course, then again, our format, which is very reader friendly, would be much more helpful than for somebody to open, I don't know, an academic theory of translation and try to learn from that for their practical experience. But so in a sense, it depends probably on person. So some learn more quickly, and they can pick up certain practical skills without going through a translator interpreter program. But they would definitely benefit from going through this. So that's why I think it's hard to give prescriptions what is better and how it should work. I observed in Africa, for example, there are situations when people start interpreting as community interpreters because they're not paid for that. It's just the community service in a sense. So there are different circumstances in different parts of the world. But definitely going through a school, and now, for example, in Europe, in the UK, it becomes more and more recognized that to work as a translator-interpreter, you need this specific degree because, again, we recognize, and the general public, academia, recognize that to be a translator-interpreter is more than just knowledge of languages or even exposure to foreign cultures. It's much more, it requires many more skills and competences.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. And I think I've seen successful cases on both sides of people who have studied something else, then come to translation or studied translation and then gone to work in a field of their choice. One thing, just picking up on that final point by Sergey, that I've noticed recently is a slight bit more openness to hiring new translators with a BA in translation rather than just an MA as well, which has been quite an interesting development. Because in the past, I mean, translation is very unregulated, but having an MA is seen as the sign of, this badge of approval that you're going to be ready to do the job in many cases, or as close as you can get. But I've had quite a few students. We have a BA and an MA here at Cardiff, and I've seen quite a few students in the last year or two in particular who have gone straight into working in in-house roles, and have been taken on with just that BA as well. So I wonder if things are shifting slightly in terms of the expected level of qualification that you have as well. I don't know if Callum, because do you have some undergrad studies there as well?
No, we don't have a BA in translation here. There are selected modules at undergrad level on translation, but unlike Cardiff and a couple of other universities, we don't have a dedicated BA language and translation. But I think backgrounds vary as well, in that what you were originally saying about training in a different area and combining it with or going into translation is also something I've seen quite a lot, because quite a lot of our students at Leeds, not quite a lot, but certainly some of our students at Leeds have done a completely different subject at undergraduate level, and then they decide that they want to move into translation, and they have the language skills by some other means, whether they've studied abroad, lived abroad, or they're a foreign citizen, for example. I think there are pros and cons to both approaches, in that, like you say, if they come from, say, a background in law or medicine, they have that deep knowledge of that field, and that sets them up perfectly for specialization in that domain. But equally, it works the other way, in that, and this touched on what Sergey was saying, with sufficient motivation and ultimately research skills, which is probably one of the biggest things you need as a translator. I think you can make yourself succeed in any specialist domain as well.
Mm-hmm. And then we also tend to specialize eventually, right? In a couple of areas, or 3-4 areas, but definitely we focus on something, because the more professional you want your translation to be, the more knowledgeable about the subject area you should be. So then eventually you go deeper into things.
So obviously, like, for people who are already translators and interpreters, like, as I mentioned before, like, we do have to do continuous professional development to, like, make sure that we still know what we're doing. Which of these things do you think, obviously we've already kind of said that a lot of these studies are useful for people who are already practicing and stuff. What do you think is the most important aspects of that for professional translators and interpreters to keep learning about as their CPD?
It's a good question. Yeah.
You're practicing translators, more practicing translators.
Well, I mean, I'd love to say ethics and, like, continuing professional development in that domain, but there isn't any training out there. I think it'd be wonderful to have workshops, and these are kind of things that are popping up a little bit. And I collaborate with the ITI quite a lot, and they're really good. I mean, they're pushing CPD a lot, obviously, and they're really good at doing these standalone things. But I think it really depends on the specific professional having a sense of where their strengths and weaknesses lie. Do you want to move into a new domain, a new specialist area, or do you feel you need to have some additional training in editing, in a new tool, or a tool that you haven't used, or something like that? So I think it's a really personal choice, and I think the range, variety, and quality of these sort of CPD elements is growing in the industry, definitely, and it's something that in academia as well is starting to shift a little bit. And I think Callum's probably going to be a good person to talk about this, because I know it's something that you're involved a little bit more than I am.
Well, just picking up first on the industry side of things, there are a lot of, not specifically LSPs, but more associations or developers that are starting to run things. So Joseph mentioned the ITI, obviously, and the CIWell both have an excellent portfolio of CPD, but relevant to what I do, the Association of Translation Companies has literally within the last month or two released a training course on project management, for example.
RWS have a few things that are popping up as well that are really interesting, like post-editing, and I know they're planning on offering more certifications.
It's like a little MOOC, isn't it? A sort of online training course. But the other one I was thinking of in AVT is Zoo. Zoo have they're starting to set up a Zoo Academy, I think, which one of my colleagues is collaborating on for some training sessions. So on different aspects of audiovisual translation. But also on the academic side, there are a lot of universities now that are starting to develop sort of, they're often called sort of micro-credit courses, where they would be the equivalent of just a few credits at post-grad level, things that you can sort of pay for as ad hoc courses and things like that. Or I think there are even something we've been speaking about at Leeds. I don't think it's coming in the near future, but we've spoken about things like a stackable MA, where you have a portfolio of little courses that eventually, if you do enough of them, could award you an MA. And so, yeah, there's so much that's starting to appear. I think, as Joseph was saying, a lot of it's down to what you want to specialise in, and the choice is growing.
I mean, we have Cardiff. Sorry, Sergey. Just because I forgot this, but at Cardiff we have a MOOC that we run called Working with Translation, which is designed to give kind of an introduction to theory and practice, and that's good in terms of CPD, but it's kind of separate from the MA study or the BA study itself. It's good to inspire students. We always have students joining our MA who say, I took this course and I wanted to do more of it. But quite having that stackable sort of, these individual modules that you can take within university, I don't think the university system quite allows for that yet. And sorry, Sergey, I cut you off.
Yeah. No, I just, while listening to Callum, I thought of that now we are also emphasizing, at least at Durham here, that our students should always think about so-called transferable skills, right? Because obviously as translators, and probably with a BA in languages and cultures or whatever else, they have more skills than those that we would describe as translation or interpreting skills, right? And they can use that. And actually one of the textbooks we're planning will be on plain language for translators. I don't know if so plain language, when documents which are written in a particular professional jargon are intralingually within one and the same language, are made accessible, reworded for the general public who may not be knowledgeable about this or that terminological vocabulary. So that's, again, another thing that a translator who works or who is being trained as a translator, interpreter, may take on board and then learn and practice eventually.
Mm-hmm. I think there are always like extra things you could go into based off what you're doing. Like, for example, for me, like when I started with doing subtitling, I then very quickly went into doing subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, which doesn't involve translation. But once I've got the subtitling skill, it wasn't too difficult to then pick that up. And like now I'm kind of learning more about, I've done like subtitle templates as well, the ones that go out to then be translated into other languages. And then there's like so many more things that I want to learn. Like I want to learn how to make like a dubbing script, or like all these other things that like you just kind of come across and you're like, oh, I'll like I'll do that. So I guess it is kind of a personal thing, and that like you can just kind of go off what you're interested in.
Just one more thing about localization, for example, right, with the advertisements. So sometimes it's not a matter of translation per se. It's a matter of reimagining a product or whatever for the target culture. And again, so that's more on your culture expertise side than probably on your language mediation side. So again, translators do that. They are being trained in that. It's just highlighting that particular aspect of their training and expertise rather than, say, a pure linguistic.
Mm-hmm. So my next question is, obviously, I know that you've all had experience in the field as professional translators, interpreters. But like, how do you make sure that the books that you're writing and that the teachings that you're giving are up to date and relevant for the current working environments of professional translators and interpreters when you're not actually like, I mean, I know some of you are still doing little bits, but like you're not actually like full-time translators and interpreters. Like, how do you make sure it's all up to date and relevant?
Well, I've already mentioned, sorry, Joseph.
No.
Yeah, I've already mentioned that, for example, with the EMT network, we were actually inviting people who run translation agencies, for example, and they tell us what they would like our students to be taught before they come and start working for them. So that's one of the ways, and we definitely keep in touch with people who employ translators or who use translators. For example, here at Durham, we're in touch with some museums and galleries or some community centers where people work with translators and interpreters. So again, we are keeping in touch with them, and we're learning from them what they might need from our students. And then our students go there for work placement, and they, again, learn something on the ground. Then I would say that we definitely keep an eye on technology development, which is an important aspect, and as has already been said here, so it's constantly developing and evolving and changing, and new products are introduced, and old products are changed to or evolving to better serve translators. So there are many ways how we obviously we have friends who work and colleagues who work in the industry, and they help us to keep in touch with the real world, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Sergey, really. I was going to say, talking to people in the industry, inviting people in the industry to talk to our students is a massive thing. I mean, personally, I attend a lot of events for the industry specifically, ask questions to people, listen to the conversations that are going on. It's been really interesting here to hear your perspective on academia and your, the things that you're interested in, actually, because then we can reflect that back to students as well, which is great. And so you mentioned already sort of placement modules. They're really popular. We have a placement module here. I know Callum does lots of like simulated translation bureau work as well, to kind of give students a real live taster of the world before throwing them out there, to do the job. I think one thing I'd just say to add is that in terms of books, it is really difficult because the translation industry is moving so quickly. Things change almost overnight at the minute, and books take years to publish. So you're writing on something that could be borderline irrelevant in some cases. So that's a very challenging thing. Even in terms of the courses we're running, as Callum said before, it takes a year to make any changes to a module. So you're constantly playing catch up to a degree, and so you're trying to keep your knowledge as up to date as possible, trying to share that in as many forums as possible with students. Running events, inviting speakers, but it is hard. It's a tricky thing to keep doing. It's an ongoing process.
I think on the tech side of things, a lot of that comes from being in touch with the tech companies as well. So, I mean, as we probably all know, with especially practicing translators, things like Trados and MemoQ, they get updated every year. We have to update our teaching materials every single year. So I teach all the CAT modules at Leeds with a colleague, and it's an ongoing process, and you have to adapt to that. Just to echo something Sergey said as well, so we have professionalisation talks at Leeds, which again involves just inviting people doing all sorts of different roles across the industry and to talk to students. So that's very enlightening to us as well, because we learn about roles that have just popped up and that we've never even heard of. And then I suppose the other thing is actually not forgetting the research that we actually do. So a few days ago, actually, Joseph and I found out we'd been awarded some funding with this colleague at Newcastle that Sergey was talking about, JC Pune, to do some research with practicing translators about the opportunities and challenges that they're facing. So that's something we'll be working on next year. There'll be some data collection, some focus groups. So even through our research as well, there's a lot of dialogue with people that are doing this on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's what helps us to keep this up to date and relevant.
And I would like here, as the series editor, I would like to highlight another important feature, I think, and we insist that each textbook comes with that feature. It's some of the materials, some of the assignments, for example, are saved for the online Routledge portal, where we would secure pages for these textbooks in this series, where authors would have an opportunity to update their materials and thus, again, help keep our readers in touch with the industry, with the real world. So that's, I think, is very important.
I think like what you were both saying about having like people who are in the industry coming in and doing talks, like I'd completely forgotten that was the thing, because I did I've done a couple of like audiovisual translation workshops for Manchester University, and I think like for people listening, it's often when I mention it, other translators haven't thought, like I think the freelance translator community, like people love to share what they're doing and they love to help like new translators, and people don't always think about like how they could actually help at like universities and stuff. And like I just signed up to I think for Nottingham is where I did my undergraduate, and then Manchester where I did my master's, and they both have like volunteer things where you can sign up to, and then they just like contact me if there's anything relevant that I can help with. And I've like done a few things like for both universities, and I think that's like a really good thing, like mainly for my listeners, like as professional translators, there are ways that you can like go to universities and help out as well to help, I think, keep it all relevant.
I would echo that as well. Again, for the listeners, if you have a university nearby that teaches translation or interpreting, they will often be very happy to hear from you. If you can find out who the director of the course is, email them and offer your services to run a workshop or a quick talk on your life as whatever form of translation you do. Because when you first started saying that, the thing that came to my mind is that we do often teach a lot of the things that speakers come in to talk to about. So we say these things to students all the time, but the students don't often believe it until someone external comes in and actually says the same thing that we've been saying to them for weeks. And when they finally come in and say it, then they're like, oh, yeah, that is true. Okay, that's great. Mm-hmm. So actually having that external perspective just helps to reinforce that what we're telling them is actually relevant. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, do volunteer. It's always good.
It's really nice as well to have, as a translator, to have that connection with the students, because I've also had like students that have like connected with me on LinkedIn and then message me later on when they start working as translators, telling me how it's going and are still asking me questions about things. And I think like it could be useful for the students to have someone working the profession where they don't know how to do something, they could just like send a message, or it's kind of nice to have that and then see them sort of join our community as professional translators and be a colleague.
Yeah, I think it's great to have that kind of mentoring going on, and I wonder if that could feed more into CPD as well, be seen as something that a translator is doing to give back to their community. And I know sort of the ITI Wales have started and are hoping to keep developing this new entrance group, which is open to students, people looking to get a start, and they offer some workshops for them, and they're available via email. I'm lucky to be surrounded by some really generous colleagues, here in Wales, who are happy to share with students, and I think it's such a wonderful thing. It benefits the translation profession in general, not just the students themselves, but I think it's enriching for the professionals who do that. So yeah, really, really, really good stuff. So
final main question, what do you think, I know this is a tough one, but what do you think the future of the studies and the profession of translation interpreting is going to look like?
Well, I can offer my view of the thing. I've been thinking about it, and I think that the relationship will be really more like what we see, for example, with, say, biology, chemistry on the one hand, and say medical profession and pharmacology, for example, on the other hand, or physics and engineering. So it's a matter of academic studies of translation will continue doing research into what, for example, a particular individual translator, interpreter may not necessarily observe, like studying statistics and, studying cases and then trying to deduce some generalizations based on such studies. And then the translator, practicing translator interpreter, hopefully they will be able to use this. Again, all of us, we hope that our profession will be respected by the general public, by our clients. And that's where like a medical doctor is respected, right? And we don't want to be in the position of a nurse who is a qualified professional, but he or she is just following the prescriptions coming from the professional who looks beyond just this particular case, right? So that's what we are trying to do. And again, talking about translation project management, that's the ability to go beyond your particular case. And for that, you need something that probably people in academia have discovered about translation, how it works in different circumstances, in different regions, etc., etc.
I think in both the sort of studies side and profession side, I think we can't answer this question without saying automation. I think that has to be one of the things that comes up here as well. And this does also apply to project management as well. We're starting to see it doesn't affect the main part of the market, but certainly affects the bulk market, especially as sort of what you might call the Uberization of translation and translation procurement. So even aspects of project management are starting to be automated as well. So on a very basic level, things like templates and batch process workflows within CAT tools already does some of that, but there's even more complex systems starting to come in on different forms of platforms. So yeah, the growth of machine translation is I would say the elephant in the room, but it's not. We do talk about it, and that will change things. Post-editing is growing, maybe not in popularity, but it's certainly growing in activity. And this is again is something we talk about a lot with our students, and this is one of the very case studies that we talk about a lot in our technology classes, is because people are always asking, will we eventually be replaced? And my answer is always that, firstly, no. It's just that our roles will change, our roles will adapt, and we'll have to reconfigure around what the technology is capable of doing and hone our skills more to ensure that what we do as humans is distinguished from what machine translation is capable of doing. And I suppose this is where the studies side of things comes in as well, in that this is a hot area of research in translation studies, looking at technology, the interaction with technology, the impact of technology, the ethics of it, and people like Joseph are looking at in particular. But also this cross-fertilization as well between academia and profession. So one of the really good things that I'm pleased to see at the moment is more and more academics are taking an interest in the real world of translation instead of these blue skies projects that they're interesting, but they're not quite so relevant to what people actually do. And that sort of interaction, I think, is going to become even more prevalent, I think.
Yeah, I think I entirely agree. I think these changing roles is something that's happening already. It's not something that's going to happen. This is happening now. Automation is going to keep developing. And what ties together both those fronts, I guess, is the question of status as well. We need to have more visibility. We need to have more of a widespread understanding of what translation is and what a human translator offers in terms of ensuring the long-term success of the profession. And like Callum, I think, I don't know, maybe if it's partly wishful thinking because we're both very interested in translation industry studies, but I think there is a lot more interest in research that has a tangible impact upon what is actually happening in the real world. And I think that's partly driven by what the universities want as well, because as researchers you're expected to be writing about things that do have impact, that are changing practices as well. So I think that probably will continue into the future. But ultimately, I entirely agree with what Callum's saying. We're not going to be replaced anytime soon, but our roles are changing, the skills that we need are changing, and this kind of encapsulates everything that we've been talking about. And I think that's why this series is so important. It's concretizing that link between academia, the things we are talking about, the things we're noticing, and what professionals want and where they're going as well.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of my sort of key takeaways from that as a translator is that we just need to be open to learning new things and developing ourselves in order to keep up with everything that's happening in the industry, and constantly kind of making the time to learn the new things, and then we'll be all good. But so I just want to say thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me here on my podcast today. It's been so interesting, and I've definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure like my listeners will have found this really, really useful as well. Just finally, are you happy for my listeners to reach out to you if they have any more questions or if they want to get in touch? And if you are, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I would imagine that all of our email addresses and the like are, well, I can certainly say mine is available on the Leeds University website. So if you search for my name, you'll find me. And I'd imagine the same is true for Joseph and Sergey as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy for it to be included on the notes with the podcast or anything as well. You know, I'd actively encourage people to get in touch if they're interested in discussing, you know, any element of the translation industry, ethics, or if they want to come and talk at Cardiff as well. You know, they're very, very welcome.
Perfect. I will put that in the show notes then. Thank you. I think that unless anyone has any final words of wisdom you want to share.
No, just thank you for the invitation.
I think it's good.
Thank you very much, Dot.
Thank you, Dot.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Meet the Translator podcast. I hope you found it as insightful as I did. Thank you so much to Callum, Sergey and Joseph for joining me today. Head to the show notes for useful resources and how to get in touch with today's guests. And if you have any questions or feedback on the podcast in general, send an email to meetthetranslator@gmail.com.